This is the Apocrypha of Azazel, and I am Azazel, your friendly god of death. As you know, we're currently reading through my journals, and I am reading Book 2, which is called The War of the Ghast. We're about halfway through the book, and today I'll read to you Chapter 13. Chapter 13 is titled, What Happened? And it's specifically for all of you who have been wondering, how did Hacktor Derkillez become king? The location is still the Rocky Pass Kingdom, and I'm going to fill in the timeline between the last 4 years, that's 295 years after Oz to 299 years, which is, of course, the coronation of Hacktor Derkillez as the great Kon-Herr Drokka of the Rocky Mountains. Shall we begin? I can sense your questions, and you have so many of them. How did King Baldur die? Did Hacktor really kill his own father? This and more I can feel you wondering. I sense your need to know. Therefore, let me satisfy your needs. But before I do, I just want to remind you that curiosity killed the cat. Oh, don't worry, it won't kill you now, but perhaps one day it will get you. And then I'll be waiting for you. In the meantime, let me give you some details to bring you up to speed. You see, King Baldur died when the twin watchtowers of the Seek collapsed in a presumed terrorist plot by the Derkka, an event that occurred approximately 298 years after Oz. Now recall that 3 years earlier, it was Princess Hekla who had warned Hacktor about a conspiracy involving a Derkka secret society called the Priory of The Myz. Hekla claimed that a group had access to a weapon of mass destruction known only as the Power of Tsar, and that they planned to use it to do the unthinkable, which was bringing down the mighty watchtowers that had protected the Drokka's western gates of Rocky Pass for centuries. Horrified at the prospect, Prince Hacktor had taken the news to his father, but Baldur being Baldur, the king had ignored it. Although I should point out that Baldur did consult the Spirit of the Well of Wisdom for guidance, and of course since that spirit was me, I told him to ignore it, which is exactly what he did. Now, Hacktor being Hacktor, the prince got mad, put some troops on double secret duty to protect the Seek, and specifically instructed his men to go out of their way to toss out any Dirk traders who acted suspiciously. Which is to say that Hacktor wanted his men to abuse any and all Dirk, making sure they felt unwelcome and sending them packing with a one-way ticket back to Gore. Naturally, nothing happened. Strike that. In reality, 2 things resulted from Hacktor's action and Baldur's inaction. First off, the price of Blackwood skyrocketed. After all, Dirk traders were having a hard time doing any business because Hacktor's men kept profiling them as terrorists and barring their entry into the Seek trading areas. This made the Drokka people mad at Monty and Thork, both of whom were horrified at the implications that nefarious actions on their part were behind the spike in prices, even though nefarious actions by this pair usually were the reason why the price of Blackwood artificially rose or fell in the past. Monty or Thork just didn't like it on this occasion because they hadn't prepared a false front for themselves to hide behind. When King Baldur found out about Hacktor's secret directives, he pretty much flipped out on his son during a council meeting and embarrassed Hacktor in public. Exactly like I hoped he would. At Baldur's direction, Hacktor lost command of his units, and General Ortwin not only pulled Hacktor's men off the Seek guard duty, but the old general then complied with Baldur's orders and relaxed the Drokka's watch considerably. At the same time, King Baldur had his loyal scribe Grak enter numerous personal missives to the Derkka parliament to explain away the recent quote-unquote administrative oversights that may have caused the Dirk traders certain inconveniences. Now, Baldur also sent along a few chests filled with gold coins. Of course, you're wondering, why didn't King Baldur just apologize to the Dirk? Well, remember, the very fact is that Baldur was a king. And I'd ask you, do world leaders that you know ever like to apologize for their actions? Of course not. They just buy people off. And that's what Baldur was doing here. All of this, in turn, opened the floodgates for Derkka of all types to besiege the Seek with trade offers. Now, as you can imagine, not all of those Derkka visitors had good intentions in their heart. And so we come to the Priory of the Myz. And here we'll pause for a moment, because I don't know about you, but I just love secret societies. I mean, you humans have such a knack for creating truly amazingly clever, well, what should we call them? Private fellowships? Yes, there are the modern cliché secret societies that you probably know about, to include names like the Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians, the Illuminati, and the Freemasons. But for the money, I'll go with the Brotherhood of Earth any day. It is the most secret, the most powerful, and the oldest of all secret societies, tracing its roots all the way back to my time with Eve. As for the Priory of the Myz, it was a little group I helped inspire shortly after King Baldur rose to power and professed his plans for peace. The Priory of the Myz was a faction of the Derkka people who were much like many of your zealots of today. You can call them hardcore nationalists, extreme peacekeepers, terrorists, whatever you like. It all amounts to the same thing, and the results are the same. They are men and women who would do anything to make the world in the, quote, ideal image, unquote, that they think it should have been in. While there's a lot of backstory to the Priory that I don't have time to tell you about, the skinny is that it was merely another trite brotherhood filled with various membership levels that equated with secret knowledge and honorific titles that grew stranger and stranger the higher one rose through the ranks. Rookies were told that the Priory of the Myz worshipped war, and that the goal of the club was to take down the Drokka. And this was also what the outside world thought about the Priory of the Myz, especially the Drokka, who considered themselves the primary targets of the Priory of the Myz. Now, mid-level members of the Priory were told something different. They were told that my alter ego Baal was the driver of the group, and these members participated in ghastly rituals filled with violence, drugs, and bestial sex in the hopes that they could entice their god Baal to destroy the earth and remake it as a gift for them to rule over. Only the higher-ups knew that I, as Azazel, was the real driver of the Priory of the Myz. Now, these lucky few members were led to believe that it was possible to attain true knowledge by helping me to achieve my goals of universal domination. Of course, what they didn't know was that I had no intention of rewarding them for their help. And the beauty of it all was that the goals for all of the ranks of the Priory of the Myz were largely the same. They were just puffed up with different verbiage. As a result, the Drokka were enemy A#1 of the Priory, and the prize token of every member of the Priory was that they wanted to take down the Seek, those twin towers of prestige that professed the glory of the Drokka and ever separated their hated rivals from the Dirk clans. Thus, every Priory meeting included plans for destroying the Seek. You should also know that word about the existence of the Priory of the Myz had first leaked to Baldur early in his kingly career, and at first the young leader paid keen attention to the warnings. But over time, and after countless flubs on the part of the Priory, the Drokka king and his generals grew tired of hearing about the Priory and instead relegated this secret society to a cliched existence. Which, like all secret societies, was the very thing the group needed to finally give it a chance for real success. And so, a few more decades passed, the leadership of the Priory changed, King Baldur and his council had long forgotten about any threat from this front, and at last things were ready for me to move my plans along. Enter Merkur, Hekla, and Heracles. This little trio of nationalists were people that I had been grooming for some time as my support staff for Hacktor. Over the years, I'd made sure that Baldur had pissed off each of them. Merkur because the secular Baldur never followed the high priest's advice, Heracles because Baldur passed him over in the Drokka armies and effectively drove him into Merkur's arms, who was all too happy to have Heracles as a general of the faith, and Hekla, well, you know what Baldur did to her. In fact, so rabid were Merkur, Hekla, and Heracles against Baldur that they would do anything to get rid of him. Couple this with Merkur's zealous belief in forcing Armageddon to bring back the god Roki, Heracles' willingness to help him, and Hekla's hatred for Queen Gawain, and the Derkka, and you have some pretty powerful nationalistic leadership. Of course, none of them would have mattered had they not also had another key trait. Each of them held a power over Hacktor, the key cog in my machine. Remember, Merkur was not just the high priest for the Drokka people, but the Wise One was also Hacktor's personal guide into the supposed depths of the Drokka religion, secret layers that I personally added to Merkur's repertoire. And as a royal Valkyrie, Hacktor was assumed to be gifted beyond even Merkur himself, although the Wise One's pride refused to truly accept this. Merkur did help lead Hacktor in his communication with the spirit of the Well of Wisdom as the faith required him to do so, but remember, Merkur had also made Hacktor his catamite, ostensibly because Merkur told Hacktor that the faith also required this too, but in reality because the priest merely wanted to force his dominance over the boy, and since this fit with my own plans, I allowed the old man to despoil Hacktor to his heart's content. As you can imagine, being the sex slave of a priest during his early teenage years wasn't that much fun for Hacktor, and it permanently damaged the boy's psyche, exactly as I hoped it would. Now, for his part, Heracles taught the would-be king about the art of war during Hacktor's formative years, bestowing him with confidence and power, which helped a bit to offset the damage Merkur had done. This also helped Heracles win Hacktor's respect and loyalty, but Heracles also played a part in despoiling Hacktor too, introducing him to the wasteful vices of wine, women, and wagering. As for Hekla, well, you already know about her relationship with her twin brother. After Hacktor returned to court, it didn't take long for Hekla to incite Hacktor's lust, and to satisfy it, giving Hekla more power over the next king than anyone else. So, now that you know all this, the question is, what happened with the Priory of the Myz's plans, and how does that relate to what Merkur, Hekla, and Heracles were doing? Well, it's simple, really. You see, I gave the lesser ranks of the Priory of the Myz access to a powerful combustible, but I kept the leadership of the Priory in the dark. And this was necessary because by this time, bureaucracy, administrative red tape, and a desire to keep the status quo in order to simply retain power had long since overtaken the Priory's higher-ups, and thus made them averse to really doing anything that might actually be construed as real action, much like the bureaucracies that you have today. The plan was for the Priory's lackeys to travel to the Seek and act as run-of-the-mill dirk traders who would be selling Blackwood's supplies. And then, once they got inside the towers, they were to distribute and simultaneously ignite their weapon. Of course, it would have been just another failure on the Priory's part if not for two things. First off, unlike all their prior weapons, the combustible I gave them this time was more powerful than any weapon seen on the face of your Earth prior to your present day. Secondly, their mission couldn't have gone on without inside help, and that's where Merkur, Heracles, and Hekla came into play. For you see, I allowed Merkur's spies to get wind of the Priory's intentions. Then I had the spirit of the Well of Wisdom stroke Merkur's ego by telling him things like,
"Dost thou truly want to be the wise one to oversee the Ragnarok? Then sacrifices must be made."
Moving Merkur along in this vein, I then had him partner with Heracles and Hekla to not only keep this knowledge to themselves, but also to use their individual influences to allow the tragedy to occur, that tragedy being the destruction of the Seek. And each of them believed that certain sacrifices were required in order to obtain the greater good they all sought. Although here I have to point out that I've always found it funny that human leaders like this seem to have no problem sacrificing others to get what they want, but they never seem to really make any sacrifices on their own. I'm sure you've noticed that too. I'm also sure you can guess where it went from here. This time things were different. This time the Priory of the Myz's plans did succeed. And because of Baldur's lax policies, Dirk terrorists repeatedly got inside the Sikh watchtowers, and once inside, they often conveniently got lost, and then they made their way to the also conveniently unprotected foundations of each of the twin towers. General Heracles used his influence to ensure the terrorists' activities went unwatched. And finally, shortly after the year AO 299 began, everything was in place. And that's when the Priory of the Myz's first-tier leadership consulted with their god Baal to get his blessing to move forward. Of course, this was merely my blessing, and naturally I did give it, because now it was time for action. Knowing what was about to go down, Princess Hekla made sure that King Baldur would be at the Sikh watchtowers at the time of the disaster, tempting her father with a promise to let him ravish her from the top of the northern tower. Little did Baldur know that this time the surprise would be on him. Yes, Hekla made quite a show of leaving Rocky Pass with plans to travel to the Sikh, and she made Baldur believe that she was going there in advance of him to make preparations for their little soiree. However, Hekla secretly turned back to the main kingdom and covertly slipped back into her apartments, and quietly remained there until the disaster had passed. Meanwhile, the wise one Merkur made sure that Prince Hacktor was also far away from the scene of the Sikh, requiring Hacktor to visit Merkur in Iztah in order to receive a message that apparently awaited Hacktor at the Well of Wisdom, thus removing any suspicion from Prince Hacktor. And the rest is of course easy to guess. The explosives blew up, the towers fell like matchsticks, and everyone within a mile of the site was killed, to include King Baldur, General Ortwin, the entire King's Guard, and countless trade merchants from all over Terra Verde. Naturally, the Priory members who caused the accident to occur also perished. They did so willingly because all of them expected to receive eternal rewards from their god Gwar in the afterlife. Naturally though, like all terrorist bombers, they were disappointed when the only reward they received was losing their soul to me. After the Twin Towers fell, the Drokka public went into shock. Now, you'd have thought that a people who'd lived on war for hundreds of years would have immediately wanted blood. But you'd be wrong. You see, decades of Baldur's peace propaganda had made the Drokka people soft. The public panicked. Throughout the early part of the year AO 299, supply lines for key resources immediately dried up, markets and warehouses were raided by looters, and prices for nearly every product soared. Unable to control the situation and besieged from all sides, Thork Drivingstone couldn't handle life any longer and took the easy way out, throwing himself off the Volsung Bridge. Naturally, suicide by the head of the Merchants Guild didn't help matters, causing further instability among the populace. Unable to get food and other basic supplies, the once fat and happy Drokka people didn't know what to do. Thinking they were under full attack from their enemies, the Derkka, rather than man up and race to arms, most of the Drokka people ran into hiding deeper into the mountain caves to escape. People got trampled. Children were abandoned and entire families disappeared. It was really a glorious thing to watch. The kingdom of Rocky Pass took the worst of it all, but as news traveled to the rest of the realm, instability followed there too. The Drokka's day of doom was approaching, but nobody was ready. Correction, almost nobody was ready. In fact, a few were, for a few had prepared in advance. Given their inside information, these few were poised to strike. I mean, isn't that how it always works? The select few generate pre-made disasters, and then when the public panics, as they know they will, those in the know take advantage of the situation to make themselves rich and grab power. power. Such was the case here. Merkur, Heracles, and Hekla executed their plans to a T and seized power for themselves. Merkur sent word throughout the 8 kingdoms that a holy war was upon the Drokka people and used his position to briefly usurp power to control events as he wished. Together with his co-conspirators, the high priest installed Hacktor as the rightful heir and the great Kon-Herr of the 8 kingdoms of the Rockies. Now, this process took a bit of time. Hacktor's coronation actually didn't take place until 6 months after Baldur's death. But eventually, everything was in place. And that brings us up to the present time. For you see, none of this really matters. What really matters is what happens next. And that's what I'm going to tell you in the next chapter. Until then, I encourage you to go to my website, apocryphaofazazel.com. Sign up for my book club so you can be notified when new podcast episodes are released. And if you can't wait to listen to the episodes, why not read my books right there on my website right now? All the books are there, apocryphaofazazel.com. And as always, I want to give a shout out to YouTube's free audio library for the music of this podcast, freesound.org for the sound effects, and transistor.fm for hosting this podcast. Until next time, I'll throw it out there once again. If you want the god of death to visit you, you need only call my name, Azazel, 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 and I'll be there.